Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fifth Child podcast, the weekly podcast where I, your podcaster for the day, Chris, give you two different recommendations, either for anime, video games, movie, television series, or whatever. So we are still continuing the month of October, and for this entire month so far, I've been trying to focus on more scary-themed or horror-based forms of entertainment. And for today, I actually do have two different forms of entertainment I want to show you today. I have a scary video game and a horror-based anime. But before we move on with that, I want to say thank you so much for listening in. And if you want to hear more, please like, comment, subscribe. Make sure to hit that bell icon if you're using a mobile device. That way you know whenever the episode drops this Friday, every Friday at 12 o'clock, or a little bit after Friday, or a little bit after 12 o'clock. It just depends on if I'm able to get these podcasts out every so often. Sometimes get pretty busy, but I've been pretty decently okay about this recently. So we're continuing on the month of October, and we're actually pretty close to the end of it. Next week is going to be next Thursday is going to be Halloween night, and I'm actually going to plan on releasing the podcast episode on that day. I think I'm going to release it exactly on Halloween. And like I said, I wasn't really building up to anything special. There wasn't a lot of scary-based stuff that came out this month that I really cared too much about, and the only one I really care about is Luigi's Mansion 3 for the Nintendo Switch. That comes out exactly on October, and I really, really don't want to finish that game as soon as possible because I'd rather savor a new game that costs 60 or so bucks. But expect a podcast episode of that sometime in the near future, sometime in the middle of November. There's a lot of games coming out in November, so be sure that I'm going to be talking about at least a couple of them. So we're going to go ahead and go straight into the video game for today's podcast. And the video game for today's podcast is Parasite Eve, a role-playing turn-based survival horror developed and published by Square for the PlayStation 1. So Parasite Eve is a very interesting little monster to talk about. Parasite Eve was developed by Square, as I said. Square Enix, or Squaresoft, or Square Enix as they're known as, are the main developers behind the Final Fantasy series, Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, and multiple other JRPGs. And Parasite Eve is probably one of their more interesting games that they have developed. There are currently 3 games in the series: Parasite Eve 1, 2, and the Third Birthday. So Parasite Eve 1 and 2 were released for the PlayStation 1, and the Third Birthday was released for the PlayStation Portable, quite a long time away. So the first game in the series was actually released on the PlayStation 1 all the way back in 1998. And is very, very similar, and is more similar in tone to some of the PlayStation 1 eras of Resident Evil games. To talk about the story, so the story is based around. The story starts off with your main character known as Aya Bria, who is an NYPD Newark Police Department rookie who attends an opera over at Carnegie Hall on a random date in the middle of Christmas Eve night in New York City. The main setting of the game being in New York City. During this opera, in the middle of this opera, during the performance, everyone in the entire opera house spontaneously combusts except for Aya and the actress on stage known as Melissa Pierce. Aya and Melissa Aya has a boss fight with Melissa on stage, and then it's revealed that Melissa is mutating because of her mitochondria, because of a parasitic condition that it causes her mitochondria to evolve beyond their regular capacity. And she also has the ability to cause this mutation in other human beings as well. This is a pretty well-known thing if you're a big memer, but apparently, if you remember, there's the meme that goes around saying that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, based on literally every single scientific textbook that we know of. And to go into a bit of, I guess, trying to talk away the science part of this a little bit, the mitochondria is responsible for producing ATP, the energy currency in the cell that can then be used in cellular respiration. That is produced by cellular respiration when you take sugars and break that down into molecules of energy known as adenosine triphosphate. So the science part of it, that a mitochondria can mutate and then cause someone to and can cause a human being to spontaneously combust because they're producing too much energy in the form of heat, is actually can be reasonably feasible, even for a science fiction game like this. That does actually have a good, strong scientific basis, and you're actually going to see that a lot in Parasite Eve if you were to play this game. So the entire game is actually based entirely on the next day, in Christmas Day, when Aya and her partner Daniel go throughout all of New York City and try to find more and more and try to look deep into the mystery of what caused Melissa's mutation, what kind of danger that Melissa has, as she slowly begins to morph into this new being known as Eve. So the game itself is actually pretty interesting in that it's all based in New York City, and you actually get to go to different locales throughout New York City. You get to go to the Central Park, you get to go to the Central Park Zoo, you get to also go to the Museum of Natural History, you get to go to the Statue of Liberty. There's a lot of different interesting parts in the game that's pretty faithfully scaled to how New York City is supposed to be. I personally have never been to New York City, but I have seen multiple movies based in New York City that are filmed in New York City. So the game does a pretty good representation of exactly what New York is like. And the game does have, like I said, a very interesting scientific basis that also lends itself to some pretty interesting bio horror. What am I going to say? There we go, body horror. A la, say, David Cronenberg or John Carpenter, like The Thing. So the entire story is based all around Aya and her partner Daniel trying to stop Eve from creating the ultimate life form, or the ultimate being, that is the final evolution of what happens when mitochondria are able to evolve past their confinings within human beings. So the story is very interesting. It's not a very long story. The game is actually only about, say, 12 or so hours long if you're just going for the story. And the game is also incredibly linear too, so you'll likely beat the game in 12 hours. There's not a lot of extra content as you're going through the game. From what I know, and for what I have also seen after that, there is also kind of a new game plus as well, that adds a little bit more replayability to it. And then there's a completely new dungeon that is based entirely around the combat engine, which I will then talk about now. So the game has a combat engine to it that is mostly turn-based, with a slight tinge of active time battle system. For those of you unaware, an active time battle system is something that was popularized by Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6 and Chrono Trigger back during the Super Nintendo era. And it is a turn-based system where your characters have a bar known as your ATB bar, your active time battle bar, that raises at a steady rate throughout a fight, and then once it is completely full, you then are allowed to make your action in a turn-based fashion. And Parasite Eve uses that same system for the most part. There's also Aya's combat is mostly focused around her ranged weapons, usually her pistols, her submachine guns, her rifles, her shotguns, or her rocket launchers, or her grenade launchers. So the entire game uses this battle system along with a range system where, depending on what kind of weapon you're using, there's a certain range that deals the most damage to whichever enemies you're up against. And throughout the game, you mostly fight random encounters. For the most part, I think sometimes the encounters are triggered somehow. They're kind of hard to figure out how exactly when they're triggered. But the game uses that turn-based battle system where you fight mostly mutated monsters at the game that are mutated by Eve's mitochondria evolution. So the game uses a pretty interesting turn-based system. There's an also very interesting inventory system that is considerably different than the Final Fantasy series and also the Resident Evil series. Throughout the game, Aya has the chance to get new weapons, and then can also upgrade those weapons using certain abilities. and then raise either their stat points or give them different stats. Like say you have a pistol that can have a rate of fire of 2 or 3 bullets or 4 bullets at the time. It could have exploding rounds. You can use two different actions in one turn. And then you can also upgrade your weapons by sacrificing or dismantling one of your weapons and then putting those stat points, depending on which ones you're choosing, to a new weapon. And that is very, very interesting. It also takes a while to get used to, because there's a good long while when you're doing... The game does a pretty good job at doling out the challenge to you pretty steadily, and then there's a pretty decent difficulty spike about halfway through the game, where it's not readily apparent what you need to do to get better. Because grinding in the game isn't exactly all that necessary. You can do it, and it actually will add probably a couple hours to the already short runtime, but you don't really need to do it. So the majority of your progression through the game and your skill progression is based entirely around you junctioning different stat points from different weapons onto your new weapon. So that's kind of it for the gameplay. I also want to talk about the graphics and music. Like I said, the graphics are in PlayStation 1 era and do look surprisingly good. The graphics of the game itself is based around the character designs of Tetsuro Nomura, who is well known for the character designs of Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts. He's the main producer and director behind the Kingdom Hearts series, and his art style works very, very well for this kind of game, and it also has the same sort of particle effects and graphical design that the Resident Evil games have, particularly with the body horror aspect. So it's a pretty interesting mixture between the two. That also does a pretty decent job, I think, of putting you off your dinner too when some of the grosser parts in the game happens, especially through some of the FMV sequences. Talking about the music, though, the music is composed by Yoko Shimomura. And Yoko Shimomura is the main composer behind the Kingdom Hearts series, and originally got her start in Street Fighter II and Super Mario RPG: The Legend of the Seven Stars. She is also the main composer behind the Mario & Luigi series, Mario & Luigi Partners, Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, Partners in Time, Bowser's Inside Story. And she also composed this game, and this is probably one of her most interesting more interesting musical works to date. This is definitely her most unique soundtrack. Throughout most of her career, she's well known for using the Mario series, she's known for her quirky kind of style, her cartoony style, and then you combine that with her Kingdom Hearts series, where she's well known for using strings and piano-based compositions. For Parasite Eve, she uses influences from both opera and electronica to melt together something that does not feel organic, and she has gone on record saying that this is the kind of soundtrack she was attempting to create. She was attempting to create a very inorganic kind of soundtrack, and she definitely excelled at that. This is definitely a very ethereal soundtrack to listen to, and it's very unnerving. I would say that this is easily one of the best Squaresoft soundtracks in the PlayStation 1 era, standing head and shoulders alongside Chrono Cross or Final Fantasy IX for one of the best Squaresoft RPG soundtracks. So that's kind of it for Parasite Eve. I don't really have too much more to say about it. Again, as I said, this was a very, very short game. Kind of glad it was kind of short, because once you get past some of the turn-based combat and once you get past kind of the scope of the story, it doesn't outstay its welcome for very long, and I think the length is just right. And there is plenty of replayability at the end of the game, with an extra dungeon and a new game plus, that if you do want to play the game again, which I think I'd be interested to play it again at some point in time. I picked the game up for PlayStation Vita on the PSN store and got to play it portably, so it was a great game to play portably, and I think I would maybe pick it up sometime later down the road, maybe to finish off the extra dungeon once I have less games I need to play. So yeah, I think that's it for Parasite Eve. I give it a pretty decent recommendation. I think it's one of the better JRPGs of the Squaresoft era in the PlayStation 1 days, and I think it's definitely worth a try if you're looking for a good, unnerving kind of horror game with some interesting RPG elements added to it. So now let's go ahead and continue on with the anime for today's podcast. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that I have not really talked a lot about horror-based anime this entire month. And that's kind of because there aren't a lot of good horror-based anime out there, really, unfortunately. There's a lot of good horror-based manga. For example, you can look at the works of Junji Ito, however you want to pronounce that, however it should be pronounced. And his manga works have very gruesome imagery, very disturbing imagery that will definitely haunt you in your nightmares. But the problem with anime is that there hasn't been a lot of anime that have consistently that have done a very good job at portraying an even-handed based horror tone throughout it. There's not a lot, unfortunately, it's kind of unfortunate that there's not a lot of great horror-themed anime out there. For example, if you were to look at myanimelist.com and try to find horror anime that are the highest rated, they're usually mixtures. For example, The Promised Neverland is the highest rated horror anime on my anime list, and it's not even really technically a horror anime, it's more of a psychological thriller. Monster also is more of a psychological thriller mystery. Hellsing Ultimate is an action series. I don't know why it's considered a horror series. Berserk is a dark fantasy. Parasite probably comes a little bit close to that, but it's more science fiction horror. So there's not actually a lot of good horror anime series out there that is just straight horror. And I think that's kind of that's mainly why I'm going to actually talk about Higurashi no Nakakura ni, or When the Cicadas Cry. So Higurashi no Nakakura ni is a horror anime that is actually based on a visual novel. A visual novel is more often than not an anime-based video game that is mostly dialogue-based, that is basically read like a book on your computer or on your video game console, that you just go through the dialogue that can sometimes be voice acted. Very rarely is it animated. And the game itself has inspired a manga series, a light novel series, and the more recent adaptation outside of that was an anime television series developed by Studio Dean, and directed by Chiaki Kon, who hasn't done very much besides that. She's mainly well known for directing just Higurashi no Nakakura ni, the sequel series within the same universe, Yuminiko no Nakakura ni, and a couple episodes of Bleach, Nodami Kantabai, and a few others. So we're going to go ahead and just talk about the anime itself, which was developed by Studio Dean. So the main plot of Higurashi no Nakakura ni takes place in a fictional rural city, in a fictional small-time village in June 1983, called Hinamizawa. And our main character throughout the story is Keiichi Mayabara, who first moves into Hinamizawa and then befriends the after-school club led by Mion Sonozaki and also her other friends, Rena Ryuga, Rika Furude, and Sadaka Hojo. And Keiichi really starts to hit it off with all four of these other characters, and starts to participate in all their after-school club activities, such as board games, card games, punishment games, and whenever you lose a game. And then all just seems like Hinamizawa is just an okay town. And then Keiichi finds more about the dark history of Hinamizawa, particularly about this festival known as the Watanagashi Festival, or the Cotton Drifting Festival, a celebration that is supposed to celebrate their local god, Oyashiro-sama. And then Keiichi figures out that once every year during the Cotton Drifting Festival, at least one person has died and one person has gone missing. And then tensions begin to rise when they figure out exactly who might be the next people to die. And then for the first 4 or so episodes of the series, we then find out more and more about Hinamizawa and Keiichi's role in that. And then also, we figure out who dies. For example, the first one to die in this series, the first one to die because of the Cotton Drifting Festival was a photographer / journalist known as Jiro Tomotake, and then the person who was disappeared, Miya Takano, his companion journalist, and then Keiichi becomes more and more aware of the fact that his friends might be hiding something from him. And it turns out that they might definitely be hiding something from him, as we see by Rena Ryugu and Mion Sonozaki being somewhat threatening to Keiichi to not pry any further. And there is some very tense sequences throughout the entire first 4 or so episodes that definitely leans itself into a very good opener, to a very good opener 4 episodes. And the 4th episode of Higurashi ends in such a climactic manner that sets the tone for the rest of the series. Now, at this point, I feel like it's important that I don't talk about that episode quite yet. I'm going to talk about the characters, and then once I get to the point, I'm going to talk about the characters, the animation, give you my general ideas of what Higurashi does right, and then kind of go into spoiler territory at that point. So I'll let you know whenever that point comes, at which point there's a time code that goes to the end of this discussion. So talking about the characters. So Keiichi Miyabara, so let's talk about our main character, Keiichi Miyabara. He's a very good main character. He's very charismatic. He has a remarkable talent. For getting to know everybody. It seems like it's very easy for him to make new friends. Likely because his mother's an author, his father's a painter, so they're both probably very charismatic people. And throughout the entire story, we get to see more and more his paranoia, his own dark side as well. And we get to learn this about a lot of other characters as well. And then throughout the series, you get to learn more and more about his past events and more how even Keiichi, our main character, may not be the bright, sunshiny character that we know him to be. So he's a pretty intriguing main character, and he bounces off well with the rest of the characters. Particularly, Rena Ryugu is probably the best character in the series. Rena, from what we see in the first couple episodes before things take a little bit of a dip, is that she's very kind, she's very naive, she's always the subject of teasing. She has this weird obsession with things that she thinks are adorable, and always jokes about, I'm going to take it home with me. It leads to some pretty interesting comedic moments, and that's one of the things about Higurashi that it does very well, is that there's a lot of great comedic beats throughout the series that is peppered in because of these character quirks. And that's one of the best things about Higurashi, is that all these characters are very, very well defined, and they can seem a little bit tropey, but it also does make it very interesting when things go a little bit awry. And then there's also the leader of the after-school club, Mion Sonozaki, who's a bit of a tomboy. And then as we learn more and more, we learn about the fact that we learn more about her Sonozaki family, which is apparently might be a little bit too interlinked between the Japanese mafia and Yakuza, just a little bit. And so as we continue on throughout the series, we find more and more about the Sonozaki household, and Mion's dark secrets as well, and about there may be more to her than meets the eye. We also learn about Rika. Another main character is Rika Furude, who's basically the secondary main character of the series, and is a constant throughout the entire series. Rika Furude is basically, for the most part, is kind of can be viewed as the head priestess of this whole religion of the Watanagashi festival. She's the head of her house, and she's also incredibly young too, and apparently has a lot to look forward to as she grows older, when she becomes more entrenched within the religion and politics of her family household. So there's not much that we really know about Rika going forward, besides what I can tell you throughout the game, throughout the anime as we go further throughout that. And then of course there's also Sadako Hojo, who is nobody's favorite character in Higurashi. She has a very distinct speaking pattern, which can grate on your nerves ever so slightly throughout the series. She laughs like an anime. She laughs like a female anime villain, which can get very annoying. But then we learn a little bit more about her past and her abusive household that does mitigate slightly her somewhat annoying tendencies and does make you generally feel sorry for her as the story continues on. So that's kind of it for the characters. The anime style's not the greatest. This is done by Studio Dean, and Studio Dean's best animated work probably is the original adaptation for Fate Stay Night, which is the worst adaptation of Fate Stay Night out there. So they don't really have a good handle on strong animation, unfortunately. And as we've noticed this season, they are now the studio at the helm of the Seven Deadly Sins third season, which is one of the lowest rated series going on right now. But Studio Dean does a very good job. Does a decent enough job. The character designs are very distinct, and when the animation does call for it, this is not an action-based series that needs a lot of strong animation, but when it calls for it, it gets the job done. The music is done by Kenji Kawai, and I keep on forgetting what else Kenji Kawai has done. I think he did the Mobile Suit Gundam series. I think he might have done the Mobile Suit Gundam 00 series. I think he might also be working on the No, he's not working on 7 Deadly Sins. That's Hiroyuki Sawano. Crap, I have to remember what all he did. I know he did Mobile Suit Gundam 00. He did Eden in the East. I think he had to have done something recently, but I must not be remembering it. But that's pretty much... But the music for Higurashi Nanaka Koroni uses a lot of heavy strings. It's it's very typical for a horror-based series. And a lot of my favorite tones is that it uses kind of those light Japanese bell tones, kind of very similar to the save room theme in Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2. It's very, very atmospheric, and it definitely gets the job done. So I think that's kind of it for the main non-spoilery discussion. So I'm not going to go too long on the spoilers, but I at least want to talk about events after episode 4 and episode 4 itself. So at this point in time, I'm going to leave a time code in the description. If you do not want, there's a time code in the description that goes on to the end of the discussion for Higurashi Nanaka Koroni. So if you do not want to listen to all of the spoiler talk right now, please feel free to skip ahead to that next part of the discussion, and then we'll go ahead and close out this episode of the podcast. But for now, here we go. We're going to go into spoiler discussions. So, episode 4 of Higurashi Nanaka Koroni. Keiichi Maebara is cornered by Mion Sonozaki and Ryuga, and they both have these weird slit-like eyes that looks like almost demon snake cat-like eyes. And then Keiichi snaps and beats them to death with the baseball bats. And then at the end of the episode, he tries to phone the police investigator. Who fueled his paranoia further. And then he begins to claw his own throat out and dies, and that's the end of episode 4. And then episode 5 begins, and it's it's a complete redo of June 1983 once again. And Keiichi is back at the after school club with Mion, Rena, Rika, and Sadako. So that's kind of the main, so like I said, this leads you to kind of feel exactly what the series is going to be about. So, Higurashi split up into two different kind of story arcs, and I'm actually only talking about the first batch for today. I might talk about the second batch later, but I just want to talk about the story arcs that are covered by the first 26 episodes or season 1 of the series. So, the entire story is based around these two separate kind of story arcs. There's the first four story arcs in the series, which are called the question arcs. So the first question arc is known as the Spirited Away by the Demon story arc, the Onikakushi story arc, and that is the first 4 episodes of the story. And then there's the cotton drifting episode, the cotton drifting arc, Watanagashi, which is almost a complete redo of Spirited Away by the Demon, except we then figure out that Mion Sonozaki has a twin sister, Shion Sonozaki. And then tensions arise, and Mion apparently goes crazy, and then Mion tries to kill both Shion and Keiichi. And then we move on to the next story arc, which is the Tatari Garoshi story arc, which is the curse-killing chapter, where Keiichi and Sadako become have a more brother and sister relationship, and then we learn more about Sadako's abusive uncle when he comes back to the village. And then Keiichi starts to get a little bit paranoid, and tries to protect Sadako from her abusive uncle. And then the next story arc is 5 years after the first 3 chapters, and then we find out about a Tokyo police investigator known as Mamoru Akasaka, who comes back to the village and then learns more and more. Not 5 years before. Not 5 years after. 5 years before the entire story, and Mamoru Akasaka learns about Rika Furude and how she might actually have, and how she notices that something weird is going on with June 1983. And it is at this point in time that you begin to learn a little bit more about why June 1983 in Hinamizawa is important, and why we have seen 3 different story arcs that are the exact same story for the most part, that take place at the exact same time, and how they play out differently each and every time. And that is the mystery of Higurashi no Nakakorini that does not get answered until Season 2. And now Season 1, interestingly enough, also has 2 more story arcs. The Mikashi chapter, the eye-opening chapter, or the Tsunami Horoboroshi story arc, or the Atonement story arc. And these 2 specific story arcs are answer arcs. And for that point on, I don't want to go into any spoilers. But the main plotline of Higurashi no Nakakorini and the video game visual novels that inspire the anime is that the story is split up into 2 different kind of stories: the question story arcs and the answer story arcs. The question story arcs have more horror-based themes to them, and also give you more questions than answers, while the answer story arcs get it deep into the characters, get a little bit more deep into Hinamizawa, and then you learn more and more exactly about why all this stuff is happening. So that's kind of it. So I think this is the end of the spoiler discussion. So Higurashi no Nakakorini is probably my favorite horror-based series of all time. Particularly the first season. Now, the second season, I think, is personally a better season, and I will talk about the second season maybe some other time. I think I don't have enough time to talk about Season 2 and why it works, but I think Season 1 has a lot of the best scares I have seen, and particularly in the character interactions between Keiichi and the other club members, especially when the club members start going a little crazy, as well as Keiichi himself. So that's some of the best aspects of Higurashi. I think there was one review on my anime list that stated that Higurashi Higurashi seems like it's the result of what happens when you stick at least 5 or 6 well-intentioned teenagers. They all get along well together, and then you leave them in a locked room for about 24 hours, and then you come back and they've killed one another. You're disgusted, but you're also intrigued as to why something like this had happened. And that is the main hook behind Higurashi no Nakakorini, because you actually like these characters going through, for the most part. Sadako's annoyance kind of notwithstanding. You want to know exactly why these characters did the things that they did. And that's all the more reason to plow through a lot of the more gruesome parts in the series. So, I think that's all I got to say about Higurashi. Like I said, it's one of my favorite anime series of all time. It's definitely my favorite horror series of all time. For a good long while back in high school, this was probably one of my favorite anime series, besides Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Naturally, I've become more of a shonen trash boy since then, and I've gravitated towards Hunter x Hunter, My Hero Academia, Demon Slayer, and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure in Gintama since then. But back then, I guess you could say I had equally crap taste in anime back then too. So I want to say thank you so much for listening in on the podcast. Again, this was the Fifth Child podcast. I've talked about Higurashi Nanaka ni and Parasite Eve 2, an anime-based horror series, and a horror-based video game. So thank you so much for listening in. This is it for the podcast. If you like what you see or you want to see more, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe in the video description, and also hit that bell icon if you use a mobile device. That way you know whenever this episode drops and the next episode drops every single Friday at 12 o'clock. If I keep on telling myself every single Friday, that means that I will get it out every single Friday. I think I did a good job about that last week. I want to keep that going. So I want to thank you so much for listening in, and I can't wait to hear from you guys in the next episode.